Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. Are you ready to sew your first block in our sampler quilt? If you are, let's get started. All right, so here's everything you're gonna need to put together the first block, and this is our first block. So this is called the double Z or double Z block. It's 12.5 inches unfinished, which means once it's put into a quilt, it's going to be 12 inches square. We're going to need 2 different colored fabric plus our background fabric. So let's see what I've chosen to make my block. My background fabric is a light gray. So this is Kona Dove. I have about, I don't know, a few meters of it. As I said in my kickoff video, you're gonna need about 3/4 or a full yard of your background fabric. So that's the neutral fabric that's gonna go into most of our blocks. So I'm gonna use this. And then the 2 colors are these 2 blues. So I'm choosing a light blue and a darker blue because we want nice contrast, mostly between our 2 colors and the background for this block, but I think those 2 will make a very cute double Z block. So those are the fabrics I'm choosing for mine. This is a backing fabric, so that's going to go on the back of our block. This needs to be at least 14 inches square. So whatever fabric you picked for your backing, cut a 14-inch square out of it. And then you're gonna need a 14-inch square of batting. I'm using batting scraps here. I have a ton of those from previous quilting projects, so I'm just gonna use that. In terms of tools, you're gonna need your rotary cutter. You're going to need, oops, I'm sorry, I'm knocking the camera over. You're gonna need your long ruler. You're also going to need a small square ruler to trim our little blocks. You're gonna need a walking foot and some kind of marking tool. I'm using a pen so you can see my marks. Now your marks are gonna be on the back of the fabric, so you can choose whatever marking tool you like. So the first step is to cut all of our fabrics. I'm not going to go through all of the cutting with you. I put a video out, I think it was last week, on the channel, and I'm going to link out to it, giving you tips and tricks on how to cut your fabric and prepare it for quilting. But here is what you'll need. Out of your background fabric, so in my case, the gray, I'm going to cut 2 8 3/4 inch squares. Now all of this information is going to be in the description box below, so if you don't want to write any of this down, that's fine. So we need 2 8 3/4 inch squares of our background, and then from each of your 2 colors you're going to need 1 8 3/4 inch squares. So 1 in this fabric, 1 in this fabric, and then 2 in your background, and that's all you need in terms of fabrics. Don't forget to press your fabric flat before you cut it. And yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead, cut my fabric, and come back in a minute. All right, so there you go. I have my 2 8 3/4 inch squares in the colors, and I have my 2 background squares right here. So now we are going to piece together a bunch of half square triangles. And what half square triangles are basically this little block right here. So you have a half triangle here, or a triangle here, and a triangle here, which pieced together makes a half square triangle. Now, what you could do is cut a bunch of triangles and sew them together and come to the exact same result. But I have a super quick method to show you on how to piece 8 half square triangles at a time using bigger squares. So that's what we're gonna do. We're basically going to be piecing 8 of these all at once, and then 8 of these all at once. And then we're going to stitch them together in rows and then sew our rows together. All right, so to get this done, you're going to take your fabric square right side up, and then your background square right side down. So you're basically putting these together, right sides together. Make sure they're aligned fairly well. I mean, we're going to trim these before we're done, but you still want them to be right on top of one another. And then whatever marking tool you chose, grab it, and we're going to draw a line from corner to corner right across our block. So take your ruler, and then with your marking tool, mark a line right down the middle. All right, and you're gonna do this for both of them. So do this for your second set of squares. So again, right sides together, one on top of the other, as well aligned as you can get them. And then with your ruler, mark a line corner to corner. Now what we're going to do, oh right, hold on, we're not done marking yet. Turn your block 90 degrees, and now you're going to mark another line from the other two, like from corner to corner the other way. So you're basically going to have an X on the back of your block, or on the back of your fabric. This way. And then I'll do the same thing to my other one. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this to our sewing machine and stitch on either side of these two lines a 1/4 inch away from the line. Now I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine, and that's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to align my foot right against that line and stitch all the way down, and then do the exact same thing on the other side, and then flip my fabric and do it on this line as well. If you don't have a 1/4 foot on your machine and you want to be very accurate, you can use your ruler and pen and mark a line a 1/4 inch on each side of the first line you drew. And those will be your stitching lines. So if you need to, mark additional lines. So on either side of your first line, do this for both fabrics, and then go ahead and stitch at about a 2.5 stitch length. When you're doing patchwork or quilting, it's usually not necessary to backstitch at the beginning and end, but it's useful to reduce your stitch length a little bit so that nothing becomes undone. So go between a 2 and a 2.5 millimeter stitch just to keep everything nice and tidy. And again, no need to backstitch. And then once you're done with all of your stitching lines, so you're basically stitching 8 times on each square. So 4 times, twice here, and then do the same thing for the other block. And then we'll come back here and I'll show you what to do next. All right, here we go. So this is what your 2 pieces should look like now. So you've got your marked line and then your stitches on either side. Now I used darker thread, so it would be super easy for you to see, but hopefully you've got a thread that matches somewhat your fabric. All right, now before we start cutting anything, it's really good practice to what we call set your stitches, or press this flat before you start cutting into it. So I'm going to quickly go to my pressing station and just give this a good press before I start cutting. There we go. Nice flat block. So now we're going to start cutting this and then magically have 8 half square triangles. So the first cuts we're gonna do is on those marked lines that you first drew. So from corner to corner, you're gonna take your rotary cutter and your ruler and cut right on that line. Now leave the fabric where it is. Don't touch anything. Don't rotate anything. Move your ruler to your second marked line and cut there as well. Trying not to move the fabric at all. So now we've made 2 cuts. We now have 4 different pieces. We're gonna cut again right down the middle now and try to match your ruler against the edge of a block here so that you have a 90-degree angle and your ruler is right across the center where all of these lines come together. And cut. And then do the same thing on the other side. Again, you're moving your ruler, you're not moving your fabric. So line up your ruler against one of the edges and then cut right across the middle. And now we've got 8. Oh, maybe I need to change my blade. We've got 8 half square triangles. There we go. Definitely need a new blade. This happens, just go over it carefully. Try not to cut yourself. So there you go. Now we've got 8 half square triangle. Cut your other squares the exact same way. So bring it over here. And we're going to start on the marked lines. Lining the ruler, or aligning the ruler on the marked line. There we go. Now don't move anything, just move your ruler. Cut on the second marked line. And then down the middle this way. Being very careful not to move anything except your ruler. And then our fourth cut. Down the middle again. And here we go. 8 additional half square triangles. So now you're ready to go and press these. What I like to do, I like to press these towards the darker side. In this case, it would be my color. If your background is darker, then press towards your background. And what you're gonna do is at your pressing station, you're just gonna open them with your dark side on top and then just flip them over like this without stretching. Just with your fingers, open them and then place the iron right on top like this. Don't move the iron around. Okay, so open them gently with your fingers, then put the iron on to get them as flat as you can. And then once you've done this for all 16 HSTs, I'll show you how to trim them. All right, so now I've got my pile of 16 half square triangles. Now we need to trim them. I'm gonna be perfectly honest, this is probably my least favorite part of the whole thing, but it is so important if you wanna have nice, sharp corners and everything match up properly. Now in our block, we have 16 of them, and they're all 3.5 inches unfinished. So basically, we need to trim these to 3.5 inches. And to do this quickly and easily, you'll need a small ruler such as this one. Mine is 5.5 inches. As long as yours is bigger than 3.5 inches, then you can get this done. And here's how I quickly do it. Put your square up on your table. Line up the 45-degree line on your ruler on the seam here, making sure that like 3.5 for me is right here. So I need to make sure that this whole area of my ruler is inside the block while still keeping my 45-degree line here right on the seam. And once I've done that, I'm going to cut this and this excess off with my rotary cutter. So just trimming what's outside of my ruler, and then flip it around so that the cut edges are now over here, and arrange your ruler on top, aligning your 3.5 inches right on the cut edge you just did. Again, your 45-degree line on your ruler should be right on the seam. And now I have an exactly 3.5 inch square or half square triangle. All right, you're gonna do this for all 16 of your blocks, and I'll come back when I'm done. All right, there we go. So I've got my nice pile of trimmings over here. Very satisfying, I have to say. And then I've got my trimmed half square triangles here ready to assemble into our double Z block. So let's set those trimmings aside. Get these over here. And what we're trying to recreate here is this block, right? So starting with our first colored block, we're going to place these this way, and then our second colored blocks this way, and then over here like this, like this, this, and then finally our last 4 are going to go this way. All right, we're ready to sew these together. So what I suggest you do at this point is take a picture. Take a picture of all of your little blocks nicely placed on your table like this, so that if for some reason they get moved around or the cat gets on your table, you'll remember exactly how they need to go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew each row together, so this block to this block, and then add this one and this one. And then once we have 4 rows stitched together, we're going to start sewing our rows together into a block. So what I do is I take 1 row at a time to my machine, sew that row together, press it, and then place it back on my table. So that way I'm never lost as to which block goes where. So to bring them to my machine, I take them, leaving them the right direction and one on top of the other, so that I know that this first one here needs to be stitched to the second one, and then the third one and the fourth one, and so on. So I'm going to take this neat little pile, go to my machine, and stitch each block together. You're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Try to be as precise as you can with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. That way, when you start adding rows together and putting your whole block together, everything is going to line up nicely. So I'm going to go over to the sewing machine, stitch my first row, and then I'll be back. All right, so here's my first row all stitched together. You'll notice that I haven't pressed anything yet. So I sew all of my rows together and then I'm going to press it. So what I do is on the back, you'll notice like the seams here are pretty bulky because you've got quite a lot of fabric intersecting. So what I like to do in these situations when I'm sewing together half square triangles is to sew my seam open. And what that means is with my fingers, I'm going to open each seam and then put my iron on the seam to flatten it open like this. All right, hopefully you can see that. So like that. So I'm going to go over to my iron and press all 3 of these seams flat and then leave it on my table and move on to row number 2. All right, there you go. I have my 4 rows stitched together, pressed flat. Everything looks beautiful. So this is where you should be at right now. Now we're going to start sewing our rows together. Now I like to start from the bottom, taking, the top row down, stitching together, and then keep adding my rows that way. Now up until now, if you're cutting, your trimming and your 1/4 inch seam allowance has been really accurate, you didn't have to match anything. You basically just sewed your HSTs together and everything should be matching fairly well. Now we're going to need to match seams up though. So as I'm adding my row here to the bottom row, I want to make sure that all of my seams here match up. Okay, so what I'm going to do to ensure that is use pins at every intersection. So if I bring this in really close, hopefully, yes, it's going to focus. What you're looking for is if you've pressed your seams open, you're going to have like a little X with the seam allowances. You see this? So I'm going to put a pin right in the middle of that X, right inside the seam. See that? And I'm going to take it to the machine pinned like that at every seam. So once again, you take your pieces, you look for that X, and then you put a pin right inside the seam. All right, and you can check the underside, my pin is right in the seam. So I'm going to do that for all 3 of the intersections, and that's going to make it really easy for my lines to align very nicely. So what I'm going to do now is when I put this under the needle, I'm going to stitch along here at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, get as close as I can to my pin before removing it. And that's why you always want to pin this way, so perpendicular to your sewing line, because you want to bring your needle as you're stitching as close to this pin as possible before you remove it. And that ensures that your seam allowances are going to stay exactly aligned. Okay, so I'm going to stitch, 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 stop right before this pin, take my pin out, continue sewing to the next pin, and so on, keeping everything aligned as I'm sewing. So I'm going to go and sew this seam and then show you where we do, or what we do next. All right, there we go. I have sewn this seam, and if I open it, you can see that my seam allowances are matched up. I'm not going to use the word perfect because I don't believe in perfection, but very nicely. Everything is aligned. So now to go and press this, I'm going to take this to my pressing station, and what I'm going to do, you could press the seam allowance open like we did inside the blocks. I usually just take the top row, flip it open, making sure my seam allowance is going up, and then using my fingers, pre-press it, and then put my iron on top. So I'm going to do that now, and then I'm going to add the remaining 2 rows to my block, and I'll come back here once my block is all together. All right, and here is my finished block. Now, if your points don't align properly, if you've got little jagged edges at the edges of your block, please don't worry. It's really not a big deal. I've made, I don't know how many quilts, and nobody has ever gotten a quilt from me and said, oh my gosh, Izzy, your points are not matching. Nobody's gonna care. And if they do, they don't deserve your quilts. So give yourself a break, and as long as things sort of align, your quilt is gonna end up being beautiful. Now, we're gonna quilt this anyhow, and after quilting it, we are gonna have to square it up and make sure it's exactly 12.5 inches square. So don't worry about little jagged edges or if things aren't perfectly matched up. Nothing's gonna show once your block is quilted and then put together into a big quilt. All right, so if you've got your block all sewn together, you wanna get any pieces of thread or lint off of it, because then you're gonna end up quilting that in there. So make sure you remove any stray threads, any lint, any cat hair, anything that might be on your block. And then next, we're gonna sandwich this block and get ready for quilting. All right, so I'm at the sewing machine because we're about to quilt our block. So I've got my backing fabric right here. I've got my batting, and I'm gonna sandwich these things together, making sure that my block, which is smaller than the other two layers, is in the middle of my batting and backing. So I want about the same amount of backing fabric around all four sides of my block. So I'm just checking to make sure I've got enough, and this should be fine. Now, you can, if you want to, baste your quilt sandwich at this point. So you can use safety pins and put a few throughout. This is not big enough, so I'm not gonna baste it, and we're gonna do some pretty simple quilting for our first block. So up to you. You can baste it using safety pins. Just put a few throughout just to keep your sandwich from shifting around, basically. Okay, so the quilting we're gonna do on this one is basically wavy lines horizontally across our quilt top. And we're gonna do this with the walking foot. So you'll notice that I've got my walking foot on my sewing machine. And what I'm gonna do, typically when I show you more involved quilting motifs, we're gonna practice on paper first, but this is so simple, I really don't see the point in practicing. So I'm gonna put my quilt sandwich under the foot, under my walking foot. My stitch length is at a 3.0 right now. I'm gonna start in the batting, so I'm gonna put my needle down in the batting. And then I'm gonna turn my wheel and put my stitch length to about 0.5 or 1. And I'm just gonna stitch a couple times just to kind of anchor my stitches. And I'm starting in the middle of my block. All right, and then I'm gonna go to a 4 or a 3 rather, and then start stitching with both hands on either side of the needle on my quilt top. And I'm gonna slowly wiggle or move my hands sideways like this. Not big movements, just gentle waves side to side until I get to the other side. And then I'm going to go down in my stitch length again and do a few stitches and cut my thread. And here's what this looks like. So it's a smooth, curvy line, nothing crazy, and it's pretty much on top of my middle seam. So you start in the middle. Now we're gonna do the same lines on both sides of that first line now, but we're going to alternate which side we go on. So let me explain that. So our first line, we started here and finished here. The second line I do on the right hand side, I'm going to turn my sandwich so that I start where I ended the last line. And I do that to prevent my block from getting twisted a little bit. There's always going to be a little bit of drag when you're doing quilting with the walking foot. So I like to switch my block back and forth just to eliminate some of that drag or twisting that can happen. All right, so next I'm going to do these about an inch apart. It's fine if they overlap a little bit. I like that look. But basically, we're just going to keep going. So anchor the stitches and go up to a 3. And then gently move your hands back and forth. All right, and here's line number 2. Now I'm using dark thread to make sure that you can see everything. I strongly suggest you go with thread that blends into your background. All right, so my second one I finished over here. So now I'm going to turn my block again and do my third one starting on this side. And then I'm just going to keep going until this entire side is done. And then I'll do the other side and I'll meet you back here when I'm done. All right, here we go. I'm all done with the quilting on my quilt. Now, like I said, I've got some pretty dark thread, so very easy to see. But if your thread matches your background pretty well, all you're going to see is the amazing texture on top of your quilt. So the last step now before we square this up, now, and you can do this all at the end, I'm actually going to wait and do this at the end, is basically make sure that our quilt top, our mini quilt in this case, this block, is exactly 12.5 inches square. But we're going to take care of that at the very end when we go to put our blocks together. So for now, because this is going to sit around for a little while, what I like to do is I like to put basically a basting stitch all around the perimeter of this little quilt, just to make sure that everything just stays where it needs to be. So go to your machine, and again, with your walking foot, just stitch right onto the top of your quilt block, all the way around at about 1/8 of an inch. And then your quilt, or your block number 1, is going to be all done. And there you go, just like that. You have your first block all done and quilted. So like I said, we're not going to trim this just yet. We're going to trim it when we're ready to assemble it into our quilt. Now, if you have any questions about anything I covered in this video, please make sure to leave a comment down below. I'll make sure and get back to you as soon as I can. If you would prefer to do this one-on-one, my email address is always down below in the description box. Feel free to send me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. All right, well, block 1 is all done. Block 2 is going to come your way in 3 weeks. So you have 3 weeks to get your block done. You can make practice sandwiches. So if you have any squares of fabric, you can always put them together with batting in between and make a few of these practice sandwiches and just practice your quilting, you know, little by little. You'll see how quick it's going to be. Like, it's going to get a lot easier for you with just a little bit of practice. So If you have some fabric scraps lying around, just make yourself a few quilt sandwiches and practice with the walking foot. And it'll be even more important when we start to look at free motion quilting. Then I'll suggest that you make a few quilt sandwiches and practice before you stitch on your actual block. All right, well, that's going to be it for me this time around. Again, any questions, put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Please give the video a like on your way out if you liked it, and consider subscribing so you don't miss any of these videos. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.